By now you've probably heard of the famous story Dr. Jekle and Mr. Hyde, where Dr. Jekle is a kind and well-respected intelligent scientist who is out to do good for the world and humanity. But within him lies a dark side, and that dark side is exploited by his alter ego, Mr. Hyde, who unlike Dr. Jekle is savagely evil and doesn't repent nor accept responsibility for his actions. In present day, the term Dr. Jekle and Mr. Hyde has become a metaphor for the complexities and duality of human nature. How within each one of us to some degree lies a Dr. Jekle, a very compassionate creature who is capable of achieving great things for humanity. But also within each one of us to some degree lies a Mr. Hyde, a much darker side of our personality that sometimes can be despicable, vile, and even destructive. In the world of motorcycling, it's hard to find another manufacturer that personifies this Dr. Jekle and Mr. Hyde metaphor more than Suzuki. On their Dr. Jekle side, you have this brand that has built some of the most iconic, cult-like motorcycles that we have ever seen. The GSXR 750 and 1000 models are some of the best budget-friendly, out-of-the-box motorcycles that have ever been made. And the DR and DRZ models are some of the most reliable and indestructible machines that mankind has ever created. Suzuki is also a company with a very respectable, long-standing championship pedigree, where they have built some of the most advanced and dominant race machines that have been piloted by history's greatest riders. But Suzuki also has a very dark and dirty Mr. Hyde side, where their overall imprudence and lack of concern at times has led them to making some of the most dangerous motorcycles that we have ever seen. In almost every top 10 death trap motorcycle video out there on the internet, you can be assured that you will find several Suzuki motorcycles on that list. And while every manufacturer is guilty at some time or the other of making a dangerous motorcycle, Suzuki seems to be the majesties of mayhem, having more and more models appearing on these all-time dangerous lists and becoming a mortal enemy to the insurance actuaries worldwide. I mean, even their cars are sketchy at times. And this is nothing new in the long-standing history of Suzuki motorcycles. In their infant years, their bikes were unreliable, inconsistent, and twitchy, earning them negative moniker nicknames like Widowmaker, Water Buffalo, the Hustler, and the Ugly Duck, just to name a few. Oftentimes, their design team seems to be made up of Napoleon Dynamite in your local kindergarten art class. So in today's video, we're going to look at the most dangerous motorcycles in Suzuki's arsenal, and how they have built some of the most deadly motorcycles of all time. And as this video progresses, you will see a constant repetitive theme of design flaws, cost-cutting measures, limited research and development, and the overall lack of prudence to solve known issues. And this has plagued Suzuki throughout their entire history. The most obvious and well-documented disaster in Suzuki's history has to be the mid-70s TM400 Cyclone. And because this bike has been so well documented online, it's not just one of the most dangerous motorcycles ever, but most media outlets and bloggers and vloggers have unanimously voted the TM400 Cyclone as the worst motorcycle that has ever been built. And the fact that all of us are still talking about this machine and how bad it was 47 years after its inception should tell you just how much of a disaster it really was. And because that bike is so iconic and epic, I've decided to save that one for last because it needs its own special section. So at the end of this video, I'm going to talk about that motorcycle in detail and share with you a few things about it that you might not have heard up to this point. So how about we begin with another iconic disaster in Suzuki's arsenal, and that would be the 1998 to 2003 TL1000S and TL1000R models. And this was a classic case of overambition combined with massive amounts of, whoops, our bad, because the TL1000 was built to take on the ever so popular and potent Ducati 916 and its successor, the 996, that was dominating the world superbike scene in the late 1990s. Now at that time, Suzuki was a successful racing team and they had won championships in prestigious series like Grand Prix Racing, and they were very successful in the domestic racing series with the potent GSXR 750. But Suzuki wanted a competitive 1000cc V-twin to compete with the Ducati 916 and 996, because while the Ducati was a very good motorcycle, it was also very expensive. So Suzuki sets out to build the unicorn of sport bikes, an Italian-inspired design that could compete alongside the Ducati's exotic looks, but with more technology and more power, and they wanted to sell it at a fraction of the price. Well, they got the looks and the price part right, but that's about where it stops. Because for starters, the TL has one of the worst motorcycle chassis designs of the modern era. Suzuki made a critical mistake when developing the TL. Their goal was to keep the wheelbase of the bike short so it would have responsive handling. But then they realized that the engine they designed was too long for the chassis they designed to install a conventional rear shock. So instead of revising the frame design to accommodate a conventional rear shock, they decide it's better to build a special rear shock to accommodate the frame. So in an attempt to save space, they use what's called a rotary damper. This is a technology at the time that was borrowed from Formula One. But motorcycles are obviously much different than cars, and rotary dampers are complex and probably too complex to explain in detail for this video. But in layman's term, consider it like a fuel-injected version of a suspension system. So example, what Suzuki did was split the spring and the damper into two separate units instead of the normal all-in-one. And the spring was located on the right side of the bike, and then the rotary-style damper was on the left side of the bike. And the damping for that shock would be provided using rotating arms. Well, the rotary arm design was faulty from the beginning, and many models didn't pump enough oil into the shock, making it inconsistent. And the unit was also prone to overheating, which would rapidly break down the oil's viscosity. The end result was a motorcycle that had temperamental handling and was highly sensitive to temperature fluctuations. I mean, imagine if every time that you went out and rode your bike, or while you were riding your bike, the rear suspension never felt the same. And if it got hot enough, it might not even work at all. As you can imagine, none of this is any good for a motorcycle rider. And to top it off, the frame was weak and the rotary arm would often crack or break. Now, they did come up with some additional solutions in the aftermarket, but it still wasn't enough to override the poor frame design. Now, what exacerbated that poor chassis was an engine that had an unholy 80 foot-pounds of torque, which was 14 more than the Ducati's 916 that had 66. Now, that is an insane amount of torque by late 1990 and early 2000 standards. And mind you, this is way before the age of electronics, so the only manageability of that monster torque lied solely on the right wrist of the rider. The bike was an absolute disaster, and it caused an obsessive amount of accidents, so many in fact that the bike was difficult to get insurance for. Now, what magnifies the problems of the TL1000 is that Suzuki used the same form of witchcraft evil engineering potion just a decade earlier with the 1986 to 1989 Gixxer 1100, another case where Suzuki got ahead of itself and created disaster. Now, at the time, the smaller and, as mentioned before, GSXR 750 was the bike to have for aspiring racers. It combined the perfect balance of speed in a very user-friendly package, and it had a dynamite chassis. So based off of the outrageous success of the 750, Suzuki was thinking, how could people not want more of a good thing? Who wouldn't want more power, more speed, more of everything? So Suzuki set out to build a monster, and they did just that with the GSXR 1100. While the GSXR 750 combined the right chassis with the right power, the GSXR 1100 had way too much power for its chassis. The GSXR 1100 was so powerful that the frame would sometimes warp under extreme stress. The frame had so much flex in it that under hard braking, the bike would swap viciously back and forth. And of course, when your frame flexes that much under those G-forces, it becomes impossible to steer. Suzuki would try to address this problem, but yet again, they would take a cheap shortcut. Instead of just rebuilding the frame from scratch to handle the power of the engine, they did the proverbial put lipstick on a pig and just reinforced the frame. But when they did this, the bike now became too stiff, giving the bike a very unplanted and uninspiring feel. But Suzuki being Suzuki decides no matter how bad it gets, we're just going to keep on building these GSXR 1100s. That was up until 1989 when it got so bad for the GSXR 1100 that Suzuki had no other choice but to try to redesign the frame, and that bike would become known as the Slingshot 1100. But despite all of their efforts, things did not get any better for this model of the GSXR 1100. Shortly thereafter, it would be banned from the Isle of Man TT races following the crash and death of Suzuki team racer Phil Malore and another crash by Jamie Whittam. I mean, when the Isle of Man calls you too dangerous, you know that's not good. Luckily for Suzuki in this instance with the GSXR 1100, they would learn from their mistakes, and when they finally scrapped that model for the 2001 GSXR 1000 and the subsequent models thereafter, those would become some of the most iconic and dominant motorcycles that we have ever seen in any era, and they are still very popular and viable today. Another tragic and perplexing mistake from Suzuki would be the 2007 to 2012 BKing model. In the late 2000s, naked bikes or street fighters became the it thing, where motorcycle manufacturers would make stripped-down versions of their race bikes and turn them into usable street bikes. The upright riding position combined with the playful detuned sport bike engines made these the perfect hooligan and canyon carving bikes around the world. Demand for these kind of bikes was so high that every manufacturer was caught up in an arms race, much like today's adventure bike scene. Ducati had just built the Street Fighter. Triumph had the Speed Triple. KTM made a Super Duke 990. Aprilia had a Tuono. Kawasaki made a Z1000. Honda made a CB1000R. And Yamaha made this FZ1. But Suzuki gave us the BKing. Instead of building a razor-sharp, lightweight, formidable, naked street fighter, they gave us the spruce goose of motorcycles. They decided to shove their ultra-powerful Hayabusa engine and put it in a cruise ship chassis. And it looks like they hired Flash Gordon to build the bike and then gave it a name that resembles a gangster rapper. I'm the BKing Baby. I'm an overweight bike that's lazy. With my Busa engine make me crazy. Anyway, needless to say, the BKing was fast, but fat. So what made this thing so dangerous? Well, obviously the power yet again was overkill for road use, and that still stands today with the Hayabusa. But at least with the Busa, you do get a decent chassis that is somewhat responsive. The BKing had the power, but its geometry was way off. This was a bike that felt like it wanted to ride you, not you ride it. Nonetheless, I don't want to be too critical about the BKing. It really wasn't that bad of a motorcycle, and when it comes down to it, looks are subjective. And if you were seeking the biggest, baddest, and boldest straight-line power rocket, well, that probably was your choice at the time. I guess in this case it makes me wonder, when everybody was headed in one direction building these ultra-aggressive naked motorcycles, why Suzuki decided to go with a BKing. I mean, they had the resources in the parts bin to make the GSXR 750 into a street fighter or even the 1000 into a street fighter, but they chose to go this direction, and that's what baffles me. So now it's time to close the show with a legendary TM400 Cyclone, a bike that needs no introduction and one that has been documented as the worst motorcycle and the most dangerous motorcycle that has ever been made. So what is it that I can say that no one else has? Well, I'm not sure that I can, but I'll try. At the time of the Cyclone's introduction back in the early 1970s, which the later generations that are listening to this will find it hard to believe, but back in those days, Japanese manufacturers had very little presence in motocross. Most people back then were riding Husqvarnas, CZs, Makos, and the like. Japanese motorcycles were just looked at as second-tier offerings by any serious motocross enthusiast. That was until Suzuki built the RN71, and it came onto the scene with factory riders Roger DeCoster and Joel Robert. And they started to dominate the World Motocross Championships with that bike. In that era, World Motocross was like MotoGP today. It was high dollar, high stakes, all out, no cost spared racing. Also, it was a time when the word works machine actually meant something. And what it meant was that it was a unique, one-of-a-kind, unobtainable machine that only 2 lucky people in this world would get the chance to ride, and you aren't one of those 2 people. But Suzuki sees an angle here, a way to capitalize on the RN71's hype and mystique. Suzuki decides it would be a great marketing strategy to build a factory works bike that the average rider could just go down to their local showroom floor and buy it. One that is so trick they could take the average wannabe local racer and turn them into an overnight superstar where they could go head to head with Roger DeCoster. So they built the TM400 Cyclone. And at first glance, this was the pinnacle of motocross machines. However, as you've probably figured out by now, Suzuki loves to build high-powered, temperamental, overlord fast motorcycle engines, then stuff them into spaghetti noodle chassis with garbage components and unproven technology. The TM400 was nothing like a works bike at all. In fact, it was a whopping 70 pounds or 32 kilograms heavier than the RN71 works bike, and most of that came from the frame. The works machine used a lightweight chromoly steel. But in a cost-cutting measure, Suzuki used the cheapest and heaviest steel on the TM400. And right there is your first issue, because not only does it add weight to the motorcycle, but the chassis flexing characteristics are far different between these 2 materials, which translated to the suspension and all the rest of the components are not going to work the same. The engine itself on the TM400 was very powerful, but also very inconsistent in the way that power was delivered. Suzuki used at the time what they called a PEI ignition system. It's like a state-of-the-art ECUs of today, but it was an unproven piece of technology, and this caused the bike to seriously misfire. The TM's vicious power at times would come on at 2,500 RPMs, or 3,500 RPMs, or 5,000, or maybe not at all. And no matter how skilled of a rider you are, if every time you open up the throttle, you don't know if you're going to get jet power or bicycle power, it's impossible to ride that bike because at some point you are going to get the wrong amount of power at the wrong time, and that's not going to be good. You see, the worst characteristic for any motorcycle is inconsistency. Any racer out there would tell you that give me something that's either consistently good or consistently bad, but at least let it be consistent, because with consistency comes expectations and then the rider can adjust. But there would be no such case with the TM400 Cyclone. With its light switch inconsistent power, it became a beast for even the greatest riders in the world to tame. Also, the compression on the TM was so high that it took a few real meat and mashed potato style kicks to turn the engine over. And it wasn't uncommon that some people got injured from the excessive kickback trying to start the Cyclone. So that should tell you how dangerous the motorcycle really was, that you really didn't even need to ride it to get injured. You could suffer an injury just trying to get the bike started. And that's what makes the Suzuki TM400 Cyclone so legendary for all of the wrong reasons. Its unusable power delivery, its poor firing order, its porky weight, and its crappy chassis guarantee that if you rode that bike long enough, you would in fact get hurt on it. And still today, you will not find any owner of that motorcycle ever say these words: I never had a problem with it, never had a bad crash, nothing ever went wrong. Because if you owned it long enough, you definitely got injured on the bike. But the real tragedy of the Suzuki TM400 Cyclone is the repetitive theme that you continue to hear throughout this video. And that is, Suzuki knew this bike was dangerous. They knew people were getting hurt, but they kept on building it until people stopped buying it. Because the worst review that any manufacturer can get is broken bones. It's as if they're purposely leading the lambs to slaughter. However, if there's a silver lining anywhere with the TM Cyclone 400, it's that Suzuki would rise from the ashes of that disaster and replace that bike with the RM370, which would go on to be one of the greatest motocross bikes that have ever been built. And that brings us to today. And the question is, has Suzuki learned anything from their past mistakes? Well, the answer is both yes and no. Advanced technology has made all motorcycles from all manufacturers more reliable and safer than they ever have been before, and that includes Suzuki. And they do make very reliable, solid machines at attractive prices. And if you buy any Suzuki today, it's not like it's the worst decision that you have ever made in your life. But there are still many demons in their closet where they continue to perplex the motorcycling community with their company direction and laziness. Like they have failed to make even the slightest updates to their ever so popular DR and DRZ models for the last 20 years. Each year, they just change the graphics on these bikes and jack up the price. And while I realize that some updates to this bike would cause Suzuki to have to meet new strict emission standards, there's still a lot of things that they could do to this bike. They just don't. Their once proud race-winning heritage now seems to be an afterthought. This year, Ken Roczen won the Indianapolis Supercross race on what is essentially a 5-year-old outdated RMZ 450. And he became Suzuki's first Supercross winner in, several years. Now, you would think a moment like this would reignite Suzuki's love and passion for racing and return them to a prominent manufacturer. But Suzuki seems as if they could care less. They didn't even madly promote this victory on their website. And when you go to their website now and you pull up the RMZ 450, it says, RMZ 450, the choice of Ken Roczen. What a lazy, pathetic, don't give an AF attitude. You'll never hear Nike say, Nike, the choice of Michael Jordan. They milked that partnership to the max. Suzuki is treating this monumental occasion like it's a bad marriage, where they feel obligated to say something nice to the other party so they can go about their day in peace. And honestly, that's quite disrespectful to Ken Roczen and his team. And it's not the first time Suzuki has done this. After winning a title at the highest level of motorcycle racing in the MotoGP series with Joan Mir in 2020, they abruptly quit mid-season of 2022, and they didn't even have the decency to forewarn their employees, mechanics, or their riders. They've all but abandoned any form of competitiveness and creativity, and they no longer lead any race organizations, they no longer win any shootouts, and they no longer stand on top of anything. They truly personify that Dr. Jekle and Mr. Hyde personality. The things that they have got right have been really good, but the things that they have got wrong have been really bad. I realize that Suzuki is not just a motorcycling company, and it makes up a small part of their overall business. But this nonchalant attitude is not what Suzuki has been known for. They've always responded to challenges in the past. They've always stood up, changed, and reinvented themselves. And I, for one, would love nothing more than to see Suzuki return to their prominence. While some of you out there might find my words towards them critical, please understand that it's not critical. It's more of a cry for help. I personally have owned more than 19 different Suzuki motorcycles in my lifetime, both dirt, street, and a handful of Gixxers. I do have a fondness in my heart when I see that S symbol, and I'm not the only one. Those of you from older generations feel exactly the same way that I do. And over the years, I've looked for just about any excuse possible to return to a Suzuki. I have dreamt of them creating another iconic motorcycle like the GSXR 750 and 1000, launching them back into the fray. But year after year, I feel like I'm just looking through a Woolworths catalog, and that is sad. So goons and gals, as I close down this video, I'm sure you would like to chime in. So put your questions, beliefs, agreements, disagreements, and criticisms down there in the comments section. Let me know your experiences that you've had with the Suzuki brand, and how do you feel about that brand and the future of Suzuki. Nonetheless, I think there's one thing we can all agree on, and that is that we hope Suzuki builds us a motorcycle with the manners and goodwill of a Dr. Jekle, but with just the right amount of cutting-edge savageness that you would get from Mr. Hyde.